So chapter 2 is essentially about cultural effects on leadership, and it pays to start with a definition of what culture is. So let's do that right here. The first bullet point there, values shared by group members. Cultures are basically a group of people who tend to think, talk, act, dress, and in some cases may even look alike. But the single most important binding factor among a culture tends to be the values that they share. So what are values? Values are things like, well, here in America we value happiness and stability and success and prosperity, etc., etc. And so, if you look around the world and you look at what people tend to value, it doesn't really change that much. About 80% of what the world values, or what the cultures of the world value, is the same. It's the remaining 20% or so that separates one culture from another, because they tend to value things differently or more so than other cultures. Customs and norms, this is just the way people act, things people assume about others and themselves and relationships. Those ideas tend to differ amongst cultures, or at least, again, there is some degree of difference beyond a certain point of commonality. Why this really matters to us is, there's a lot of ways you can slice and dice what culture does to the world, but what we care about here in this course is how do people behave, both leaders and followers. And so it pays to know, what is it that is driving that behavior. And one of the major determinants is going to be culture, and what the culture values. So we already talked about the uniqueness of cultures and how they make one group different from another. But again, with cultures there are commonalities and differences, and so let's keep that idea in mind as we proceed. So this slide briefly shows the idea that culture occurs on different levels. You've got the culture of your country. So, here we are in the United States. We've got an American culture. And then you've got a group culture, which can refer to a lot of different things, but typically it's going to mean some kind of a regional culture. So we are somewhat different in the Northeast versus how we are in the Southeast versus how we act and think and feel in the Midwest versus in California and the West Coast, etc. Okay, and these differences, by the way, can be very pronounced, and some would say in our country they pretty much are. And I've read research to that effect. So, you can't assume that everybody from the same country is really the same, because they typically aren't. And as the country gets bigger and bigger, and we here in the United States are a pretty big country, both in terms of population and in terms of geographic size, that effect gets more and more distorted. The last kind of culture is organizational culture. So, you belong to a country, you belong to a region or a state or a county, and then of course there's where you work, or the organizations in which you spend most of your day, whether it's school, work, play, etc. And those have their own cultures. So people, it's interesting, people walk in and out of different cultural settings every day, as they go from place to place, and each of those cultures, even though they may be essentially in the same place, the same town, have different cultural norms and values and assumptions and all these things we talked about on slide 1. So this slide is about Hall's cultural context, which separates cultures into high and low context kinds of cultures. And the key distinction between the two is how explicit people within the culture are about doing things. And the ways in which they make those things explicit. So what happens is, if you are in a low context culture, I'm going to start with the one on the right here, In a low context culture, if it's not in the contract, meaning it's not specified, you will do X and Y and Z, then X and Y and Z typically don't get done because the agreement to do work and the agreement as to how to behave in any interaction is typically specified very explicitly on paper or talked about, oral or written kinds of means to express desires, and that's what gets followed. In contrast, high context cultures don't rely on contracts as much. Not that they're absent from the culture at all. I don't want you to think that. Everything here is about a matter of degree. And so in high context cultures, what happens is that things like trust and gestures and body language and position and rank kind of determine the way things are going to get done and what is going to get done, rather than what's on a piece of paper or what the explicit verbal instructions were. So you'll very often see, contracts will be signed, but they don't get followed to the letter, or things happen outside of the contract, or things that were agreed to inside of the contract are not followed through on because this is the way people in a higher context culture act. Everything is about trust and the relationship I have with you that's going to dictate what I do for you or don't do for you. So just a quick example. Here in the United States, we tend to be pretty low context. If it doesn't get written into the contract, it doesn't get done for the most part. Then you go to a country, any country pretty much in Asia is going to be the opposite, high context. And it's interesting. Americans will often go over there and try to set up businesses and organizations and sign contracts, only to find out later that nobody really enforces them, and that's just the way it goes. So sometimes, most of the time, that works not in your favor. A minority of the time, it actually is helpful if you didn't do the right thing in your original contract. So totally different cultures as far as context. So this follows up on the last slide, which talked about high versus low context. And here you see examples of countries along the spectrum here of high to low context. In this particular list, Japanese are the highest context culture in the world, and looks like the Swiss Germans are the lowest. Just a couple of things I want to point out that are kind of interesting and noteworthy. You'll notice that most of the Asian cultures tend to be high context. You'll notice that most of what I'll call the Nordic cultures, like the Scandinavians and the Germans and the Swiss Germans, and probably the rest of Northern Europe, tend to be low context. Everything is reduced to contracts and words and specified as such. And then in the middle you have the rest of Europe, essentially. Okay, and so it's interesting to just note that contiguity in geography actually does dictate how a culture will act typically. Meaning, because I live next to somebody else, China and Japan are kind of next to each other. Korea and Japan are kind of close, etc. So, the culture pretty much is similar, especially when it comes to high and low context. So next we talk about Hofstede's cultural dimensions. Just a quick background on Hofstede. He was a guy who worked for IBM, and they would send him to all these different countries to sell IBM products. And so as he ventured in and out of all these different cultures, he started to notice certain patterns emerge, and he put together a model that could help explain and predict how a culture was going to act in certain situations. And so the dimensions he came up with are the ones that you're seeing here: individual, collectivism, power distance, uncertainty, avoidance, masculinity, and time orientation. We're going to go through each one of these, and sometimes they'll take on slightly different names, and you'll see also that Hofstede's dimensions made their way into a broader model called the globe, which was part of the globe study, so we can call it the globe model if we want. But it all started with Hofstede. He was kind of the pioneer in dimensionalizing the various cultures in the world. And the cool thing about this model is that you can literally describe any culture using these 5 different aspects. And they're exhaustive, pretty much. There might be only 1 or 2 others that some researchers would say matter, but this is really what it reduces down to most of the time. So the first Hofstede dimension is the individualistic, collectivistic dimension. And again, this is 2 polar opposites, essentially, of one dimension, which is how you relate to groups, essentially. If we're talking about cultures that are more individualistic, then really the prime goal of most people in that culture is to function as individuals. And we all know, you can't get along without other people. That's just the way life goes. But in individualistic cultures, there's more of a tendency to want to kind of live your own life apart from other people's values and norms and assumptions, etc. Okay, so we call these individualistic cultures, and we say the individual is autonomous from the group, meaning the group is not running the individual's life and directing their activities. Okay, now again, can any culture really ever have this 100%? Of course not. Even in the most individualistic cultures, and we, by the way, in America are pretty individualistic, or at least that's what the studies say, we still wind up interdepending on each other and having group norms. So, I would argue there's never anything such as a purely individualistic or even collectivistic kind of culture. Your goals in an individualistic culture are more important than the group's goals. Okay, so, when someone is in an organization here and decides they want to move on because they're not fulfilled or they're not happy or they're not this, that, or the other, it is perfectly acceptable within our culture to do that, whereas in other cultures that is seen as being selfish and not beneficial for the group that is invested in this person who has come to work for this organization. So again, different cultures value different kinds of behavior. I'm going to skip down to bullet point 4. Relationships are based on exchange. So you give me something, I'll give you something. Okay, it's all about what can you do for me before I'm going to do for you, or I'll do for you as long as you're doing for me. And that's very much an individualistic mindset. Whereas in collectivist cultures, it's more about what are you doing for the group, and you shouldn't expect a return from the group per se, even though you do get returns, such as acceptance within the group and the benefits that the group can afford you, but that's not really the mindset. This last bullet point needs a little bit of explanation. It says, others are far and not part of the self. So, people keep more of a distance between themselves in individualistic cultures because, frankly, there's just less trust, typically, when people are trying to do things for themselves rather than the group. So we say that others are far to encapsulate that notion, and then not part of the self. The self actually loses meaning in some ways in collectivistic cultures, where you're taught to not think of yourself when you're doing pretty much anything. It's always about what are you doing for the group and how are you helping the group survive. Okay. So I think you have a good understanding of what individualistic cultures look like. Let's move on to collectivistic, which is the next slide. So according to Hofstede, if you're not an individualistic culture, you're a collectivistic culture. And here we introduce the term in-group and out-group. It's important to understand what these things mean. The in-group is the group that you're part of, that you belong to. Okay, so think about back when you were in high school, you had your friends that you hung out with all the time. And then there were those who you didn't hang out with, but maybe wanted to hang out with you. So the friends that you hung out with regularly, those were your in-group. The ones that wanted to hang out with you but couldn't were the out-group. So the out-group are people that you don't relate to, and in-group are people that you do relate to. In collectivistic cultures, the group is the primary unit of importance. So all decisions, all behaviors, all considerations defer to group goals. Okay? So bullet point 2 there, group goals have priority over the goals that individuals have. In fact, individuals essentially shouldn't really be having goals in most collectivistic cultures. That's the kind of the mindset. So out of that comes the idea that social norms, which are norms that groups create, whether that group be the entire country or your local town or your family, depends on the context we're referencing. The norms that are established by that group are going to determine how you should behave, and they will issue sanctions against those who do not behave in such a manner. Okay. So, that really kind of goes along with bullet point 4, which is that relationships are based on communal terms or the social norms of the group. Everybody is supposed to act the same way. Exactly the opposite of an individualistic culture where people set their own mark on the way to behave, which, again, I've said before is not 100% true, even in individualistic cultures like the U.S. The last point is also important, which is if you're not part of the in-group in a collectivistic culture, it's very hard to get into that in-group. In fact, it's nearly impossible. Think about, certain countries, their cultures are organized around primarily the family structure, and you'll only do business with somebody within your family because there's a low level of trust for people outside the family. Think about some Arabic cultures, think about some Asian cultures that operate in this way. Although, that's actually changing a little bit as some of these countries modernize a bit, I guess is the word I want to use there. I don't know if modernize is the right word, but I'll use it for now. So anyway, in-group members are close, meaning, once you're in that in-group, you are extended all the privileges of being in that group. Whereas if you're in the out-group, the way the in-group relates to you is they basically don't even know you're there. They will not do business with you. If they are doing business with you, you're not going to get fair terms. You're going to get mistreated typically because you're not part of the in-group and because you don't have that relationship with the in-group members. So we say out-group members are far. The idea here is pretty simple. Within the framework of individualistic and collectivistic cultures, we have this idea of vertical and horizontal arrangements, which really refers specifically to whether there's equality amongst its members or whether there's a hierarchy, which by definition implies an inequality in power and position. So we're going to use this to talk about a few models coming up in the next couple of slides. So you can have two different kinds of collectivist cultures, one being vertical, one being horizontal. The main point that this and the next slide are going to make is that there are really two separate issues to contend with when it comes to classifying cultures using this model. This is one researcher's model of how to view a culture. And just because you are a collectivist or individualistic kind of a culture does not necessarily dictate whether you have or do not have hierarchies. You can have hierarchies or equality in either the collectivist or the individualist kind of culture. So the first of the two possibilities are when you have collectivist cultures, that are vertical or horizontal. The vertical means there is a hierarchy. The horizontal means there is not a hierarchy, so that everybody is equal. Okay? And the next slide we'll see the other two possibilities. So here we're talking about the individualist cultures that can be either vertical or horizontal. Again, vertical means you have a hierarchy. Horizontal means there is total equality amongst all members. It would seem, at the outset that if you're in an individualist kind of society or culture, that individuals might be considered to be equal, but it's not necessarily true. You can have individualistic societies where, because of the high level of individualism, that actually forces people into a hierarchy. But yet you can still be individualistic if you are at the lower end of that hierarchy. It's just that you're probably answering to other people who have more power, whether positional or otherwise, than you. And again, the two really have nothing to do with each other. The vertical horizontal dimension and the individual collectivist, because you can have all four possibilities. I want to take a quick look at Trumpenauer's cross-cultural model for organizational cultures. What he does is he takes all cultures and he classifies them on two dimensions. One dimension is egalitarian versus hierarchical kinds of environments, and that's the vertical axis. The other dimension is a person versus task orientation. Let me define that for you briefly, and it's a concept we're going to come back to in full force in the next few chapters. There are two kinds of people in the world, in organizations, according to this conceptualization. There are people who are task-oriented and people who are relationship or person-oriented. And so, briefly, a task-oriented person would be somebody who just cares about getting the task done and is not really into forming relationships in their organizational environments. Okay? It's not that they're unfriendly or impersonal, it's just that their main focus and their main concentration is on getting the task done. Person or people-oriented or relationship-oriented types are the exact opposite. They're not focused on tasks. They're focused more on building relationships with the people around them, which eventually would lead to, of course, the tasks being accomplished. I mean, basically, any organization exists to accomplish a set of tasks. So whether you do it with a task focus or relationship focus, that's a matter of leadership style. And so then you can classify cultures based on that continuum. And when you have those two dimensions that you use to classify organizations, you wind up with four cells: the incubator, the guided missile, the family, and the Eiffel Tower organizations that are essentially distinctly different from each other. So just to take one example, the family type of organization is high on person or relationship orientation and also high on the hierarchical structure, which of course means that there are levels of management and levels of leadership. And so then you get an environment that is, according to what's written here, power-oriented with a strong, caring parent figure, kind of a leader who's focused, of course, on building relationships. So I won't go through the other ones, but you start to see some of the genius in the classification system here, and how you can start to map different cultures to different organizational types. And so that's where the model is useful, and it'd be a good exercise for you to figure out where it is that you work and what kind of environment that you are currently in, and then also maybe what environment you want to be in and what environment you might want to create as a leader. Which one of these four cells does it fall into? So now we continue on with the Hofstede and globe dimensions. I'll talk about the globe study a little later, but just realize that these dimensions apply to both models and conceptualizations of organizational environments. Power distance is an idea that people will accept uneven distributions of power. Okay, it's not necessarily that there is an unequal distribution of power that means you have a high power distance environment.
The distinction is that to the extent people accept the fact that there is unequal distributions of power, you have a high power distance society or culture or group. Okay, so if we talk about American culture versus Mexican culture, American culture is moderate on the power distance, meaning that we kind of accept it, we kind of don't. Okay, the fact that there is unequal distribution of power. When you move to the Nordic countries in Europe, Germany, Switzerland, Finland, etc., they have very much lower power distance kinds of cultures where they don't really tolerate unequal distributions of power because the cultures tend to be very egalitarian. Go to Mexico, and that's just the norm, that you have a high power distance society, meaning that people tend to expect the boss knows everything and has all the power, and the subordinates have none of that, essentially. They don't know much, but they learn from the boss, and they take orders from the boss, and so on and so forth. But there's a definite hierarchy, and more importantly, the workers or the subordinates or the followers accept the hierarchy. It's all about the acceptance of the hierarchy and the power differential, which means you have a high power distance culture. I'll move on to uncertainty avoidance, which is exactly what it sounds like. If you're uncertainty avoidant, you don't like uncertainty. You want to know what you're getting. And in general, human beings don't like uncertainty. It doesn't really matter who you are or where you are or what you're doing, whether it's work or personal life. Who likes uncertainty unless it's, kind of playful uncertainty where you're at a movie and you're trying to figure out who done it kind of a thing. But, that's how often do you do that? That's very rare. So, in general, again, there's a general dislike for uncertainty, but then some cultures have more of an aversion to it than others, and we call those high uncertainty avoidance cultures. When you want to know everything that you're getting, you want to know what the future looks like, you don't want to leave it up to chance. So, what happens in uncertainty avoidant cultures is they tend to have more norms and rules. And what norms and rules do is they cut down on the amount of uncertainty in the future. Okay, remember, you can't have uncertainty in the past and the present. It's only about the future orientation, because the past and the present are either happening or happen, and so it's certain. Although you may not like the outcome, it's certain, you know what you've gotten or are getting. Let's move on to human orientation. This one is fairly straightforward. Degree to which fairness and kindness are valued. So if you value fairness and kindness, then you are high on the human orientation scale. A country that comes to mind that definitely values this and is high on human orientation is the Philippines. I know this from personal experience working with Filipino people on various projects, and I just know that the culture, and the research would document that the culture in that particular country is very high on fairness and kindness, whereas other cultures that are not Filipino are much lower. Collectivism 1 and collectivism 2. So you see there in the parentheses, institutional versus in-group. Institutional refers to how much equal distribution of resources there is, which we'll call collective action. And then collectivism 2 is how close you are to your in-group, which could be your family, could be your organization. In some cultures, family equals organization, because that's the way business gets done. Just go to the Middle East, go to lots of parts of Asia. The family still is the organization in a lot of cases. Now these dimensions are just globe dimensions. This is where globe picks up where Hofstede leaves off. And just quickly, globe is a study that, again, picked up where Hofstede left off and broadened the analysis of dimensions to a bigger list than that which Hofstede looked at. So it was a much more extensive study, but it was all based on Hofstede's work. So let's look at these dimensions. Assertiveness, degree of directness and confrontation that's present in a culture. So here in the United States, we tend to be fairly assertive. We're not at the top of the scale, but we're definitely nowhere near the bottom. So, but we edge towards the upper ranks of assertive cultures. Whereas if you go to Japan, Japan is actually not an assertive culture. They believe more in harmony, and harmony and assertiveness do not go hand in hand. So the Japanese are famous for saving face and ensuring internal harmony in their organizations, and that's the way they tend to run their companies and their organizations. Let's move on to gender egalitarianism. So we talked about egalitarianism in the general sense, where everybody's either equal, or there's a hierarchy, or there's something in between. Now we're talking about that concept as it relates to males and females, genders. And so are males and females equal in terms of the power they have, the responsibilities they get, the accountability that they have, etc.? And so a gender egalitarian culture, males equal females in terms of all those things, whereas if it's not egalitarian or scores low on egalitarianism, then typically one sex is going to be much more responsible, accountable, powerful than the other as far as what happens in the workplace. And of course, I don't have to tell you, this is typically the males having more power than females. Just about every country in the world, that's true. Here in the United States, we tend to actually have a fairly egalitarian society, and it's not something that's, of course, been around for a long, long time. This all began with the 1970s push for the Equal Rights Amendment and the whole feminist movement, which, the feminist movement happened, but the ERA never happened. We never had that amendment to the Constitution. But it got the whole society thinking about equal rights for women, as far as what happens in the workplace and pay scales and that kind of thing. So we are much more so than just about every other country in the rest of the world a gender egalitarian society. Maybe Canada would be just about as egalitarian as we are too. But if you go to Asia, the Middle East, certainly they're much more kind of old school, traditional, where men have many more rights than women in just about every walk of life. So there's very little egalitarianism there. The trend is, United States and the Nordic cultures tend to be more egalitarian. Asia, Africa, and Middle East tend to have much less egalitarianism, although that is changing. If you look at a country like Egypt or even Iran nowadays, you're seeing a lot of changes which are going to make those countries look a lot more like the United States as they push for reforms. Okay, but who can necessarily predict the future? It's kind of all burgeoning right now, just to make you aware. Time orientation. This is the extent to which that you look into the future, the present, or the past. Okay, so some cultures are present-oriented, which means they only focus on the here and now. Some are future-oriented, which means they're always planning for the future, trying to build a better life for themselves in the future. And then there's other cultures who look backwards completely, and they base all of their decisions and thinking on what happened years and years ago. And this can stretch back a long, long way. Especially if you go to Europe. A lot of European cultures are very backwards in time oriented, or what we call past oriented. They'll remember, the war they had with the United States or some other European nation, and they will say that they don't like those people because of that war they had 200, 300, 400 years ago, which I think is kind of silly, but that's what happens. And those are examples of cultures that are very past oriented. Here in the U.S., we are very future oriented. We're always planning for the future, which some would say is kind of detrimental to our experience of the present. But I won't get into that debate other than to say that here in the U.S. we're very, very future oriented. And so it's interesting to go around and see how cultures differ in these dimensions. Last one is performance orientation. Do we value high performance or not? And so countries like Italy, I think, are low on that scale. Italy is a much more relationship-based kind of a country than it is a performance-oriented kind of a country, which is not a value judgment. Italy is my favorite country in the world. It's the first place I'm visiting when I get some time. I love the Italian culture. But as far as how they rate on performance orientation, it's a low performance orientation, primarily because it's more of a relationship-based culture. Here in the U.S., we're very, very performance-oriented. That is our probably number one priority as far as who we hire, who we keep on our payroll. and what we value as a culture. Japan, same kind of thing, but probably a little less than us actually. Japan, relationships actually matter too, to a certain extent, but so does performance orientation. So it's not a country that's quite as low as Italy, but not quite as high as we are on performance orientation, believe it or not. Here I'd like to introduce the concept of diversity. We're going to come back to diversity in full force towards the end of the course, where we study it as a separate module. But your text gets into it a little bit, so I thought I would introduce the idea here. And the main message is that diversity is a much broader concept than people tend to think it is. Your text separates it into two categories, primary and secondary dimensions. And in the primary category, you've got what everybody tends to think of diversity as being a matter of ethnicity. And then even there you see it goes beyond that. It's ethnicity, race, age, sexual orientation, gender, disability. And then you broaden the analysis to another level, which looks into things like marital status and religion, income, education. So basically there's a lot of different kinds of diversity, even though the ethnic piece of diversity is the one that most organizations tend to focus on. So keep that thought in your mind as we proceed through the course and come back to it later, that managing diversity, which is a necessary thing these days, is a really complex process that is often overlooked in a lot of dimensions. The next couple of slides deal with the gender and leadership issue, and the basic story here is that women, although they have made great strides over the last 30 to 40 years in the United States, are still in many ways disadvantaged in the workplace and as far as leadership goes. And so you'll see a whole laundry list here of facts and figures that kind of demonstrate that case. But again, even after looking at these facts and figures, you have to put everything in perspective and say that women are doing a lot better than they were doing 30, 40 years ago, before we had the equal rights movement and everything that came out of that. So that's kind of the general idea, and then I will skip a slide here with the narration and let you look at the stats on the next slide, and then pick it up in 2 slides from now. So there have been a bevy of studies that look at why is it that women are not achieving as many high-ranking positions as men are, and why is it that they tend to get paid less than men do, and all the other issues of inequality that go along with gender-based reasons. And so you have here, again, another list of the top reasons that the research has uncovered as to why this is happening. I'm not going to go through each and every one here, other than to say, well, one thing in general, and that is, remember again, these are global studies, and in most countries besides the U.S., there is not gender egalitarianism, as we discussed before. That is to say, men have a much higher position than women and higher status than women. Here in the U.S. and in Canada, it's much more equal. Not exactly equal, but much more so than any other place in the world. And also, again, in the Nordic countries, you tend to see that tendency as well. So that's kind of a backdrop for why you're seeing it globally, and then it manifests itself in a lot of different ways, some of which you're seeing here. The other factor that I'll point out that is really changing a lot, especially in the U.S., is the education piece. That's the upper right bullet point there. It says women are less educated. Not exactly true anymore. Globally may be true, but not exactly true in the United States. If you look at just about every degree program out there, besides engineering, some of the hard sciences, and business, you'll find that there are more women attending school and getting degrees, advanced degrees as well, than there are men. And it used to not be that way. It used to be the exact opposite, where women were in the minority in professions like law and medicine and public administration, even relevant to you guys, but not really the case anymore here in the United States. And I suspect that you're going to see a similar kind of change in places like the Mideast and even Asia as time goes on. So a lot of these factors, again, are becoming, I shouldn't say a lot, some of these factors are becoming less relevant over time, and, it really does look much, much better globally for women than it did, say, 30, 40 years ago. The last topic in Chapter 2 that we'll discuss is cultural mindset, which is very, very important in being able to be a good leader or a good follower, for that matter, in just about any organization you're going to work in. Whether the culture happens to mean something related to geography, ethnicity, or just organizational culture. You can be working here in America in a U.S. firm or organization, and you may not have any foreign or expatriate workers. It may just be people who are local to your town working there, and there's still a culture that you have to deal with. So no one's going to deny that culture matters. And as bullet point 2 is saying there, it's integral to all thoughts, decisions, and actions, and not an afterthought. The thing is, though, you don't do much thinking about culture. You just kind of respond to it automatically and function in it automatically without doing a lot of deliberation and decision making that you actually sit down and say, okay, what would the culture think if I did this? Because you're just used to your culture and you're in familiar surroundings most of the time. But then, of course, when you change jobs or maybe you go abroad or something like that, you can't afford to keep doing that. You have to be aware of the nuances and sometimes the drastic differences between the culture you came from and the culture that you are now in. So that's what cultural mindset is really all about. To the third bullet point there, having a way of approaching people and dealing with people that goes way beyond just having a bunch of basic skills that anybody can acquire very quickly. Having a cultural mindset takes practice. It doesn't happen overnight, and it's one of those things that you're continually shaped by until you're doing it well, which can take, again, a number of years, as many administrators and executives tend to learn. So now we'll end the chapter with going through the list on what are the exact elements of being culturally minded and having a cultural mindset. And some of these overlap, I will admit at the outset here, but some of them have unique contributions. So start in order here. Open to and aware of cultural differences and their impact on perceptions and behaviors. That's absolutely crucial. Most of the conflict that occurs when you put people from different cultures together is not so much that bad work is getting done. It's just that nobody really understands what the other person or people are doing and what's driving that behavior, and they assume, therefore incorrectly, that they're just not good employees or good colleagues or good leaders or followers, when it's usually the culture that's driving the difference in work style and the difference in values. So just knowing that the differences are out there is ultra important, which ties in with number 2, being inquisitive about how others do things. So, if I'm going to work in a foreign culture, or if the foreign culture is coming to me, I want to read about that culture and find out what they value and how they do work, and what's their modus operandi. I want to know everything I can about them through reading and talking to other people. Obviously, you want to appreciate and respect the diversity that goes along with being inquisitive. Then also, celebrating, taking an interest in other people's cultures and not faking it. You can do it where you're pretending to be interested, and people catch on to that very quickly. Going to one event a year just to show your respect, not going to do it. But if you go to a couple events that someone from a different culture is holding, or you have lunch with them pretty often, or whatever it is that you need to do to show that you really care about their culture and you really are interested in learning more. Learning a language, by the way, is one of those things that really shows your intent. And Americans typically are averse to learning foreign languages, mostly because they don't need to. Most of the world speaks English, right? But if you can push yourself to do that, that's gonna take you pretty far as having others perceive that you appreciate and respect their cultures. Be aware of your own culture. People are their own own worst observers, because you can't really observe yourself most of the time. Psychologists have been saying that for years. So people don't really tend to understand how their culture is perceived as being not consistent with others. So when we go abroad, or when we work with somebody who's not from our culture, they're looking at us kind of funny and saying, "Oh, what is this person doing? Why are they doing it that way?" Just as much as we're doing it to them. So you have to understand, again, your own culture, and part of the course is meant, this course and others is meant to help you do that. We talk about the Hofstede dimensions and the globe dimensions, and where Americans score on those dimensions versus other cultures. Be willing to learn, share, and exchange cultural information. Again, that I think goes along with some of the other bullet points and is fairly obvious. So the last 4 bullet points that deal with having a cultural mindset. One, seeing yourself as part of the world. Don't think of yourself as an American necessarily. Think of yourself as a world citizen who is functioning in a world ecosystem. Because people like similarities, and we like diversity too. But as far as kind of getting along and getting things done, people want to understand, and they want people who are more similar to them. Every bit of research I've ever read has uncovered that fact. And that can be dangerous, but it can be beneficial in some ways. But seeing yourself as part of the world helps along those lines. I mentioned this second one before. If there's a problem, typically it's related more to culture than it is to just incompetence or lack of motivation. So always be on the lookout for those kinds of explanations and see if they make sense. And then if there is a problem that the culture clash is creating, then address it and understand you have to start with explaining to the offending party, for lack of a better word, I don't know what to call it, that that is not consistent with the local culture, and so maybe you ought to think about trying to adopt it this way. And sometimes you don't take that tack. Sometimes you just kind of deal with the fact that there are cultural differences, and you work around them. So it's a judgment call that leaders have to make. And it's not an easy one to make. I've been in those kinds of situations where you just have to say, look, that's the culture. You're not going to innovate their culture. So let's just find a way to work around the problem and get the projects done. And so that kind of is the last bullet point also, in a nutshell. So congratulations on being done with Chapter 2. We'll see you in Chapter 3.